So I've now changed the status of our panelists to co-hosts, which means that they can turn on their video if they want. You can turn on your microphones also, but not everyone at the same time when it's your turn. Our panelists are Professor Marie Fitzduff from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, Professor Assam Khamaisi from the Department of Geography here at the University of Haifa, and Dr. Muli Peleg from the Peace and Justice Program at Fordham University. Unfortunately, Dr. Maya Kahano from the Hebrew University was unable to join us today. Each speaker will give a 15-minute talk, and then we will have time for Q&A. Our first speaker is Marie Fitzduff.
First of all, let me start by saying how marvelous it is to be with you all. The numbers that have turned up are tremendous. I'm sorry we're only meeting virtually, but there is something to be said for having conversations like this, because for a lot of you probably traveling, even if it were normal times, it might have been more difficult than meeting each other on the web. And certainly I appreciate not being jet lagged and having to come 7-10-hour journey to be with you. So there's something to be said of making the best of the situation we're in. I'm delighted that I was asked to comment on this because I have been to Givat Haviva and I'm a great admirer of the work that they're doing for reasons that I'll talk about as we go through the presentation. The first question I was asked was the strengths of the book. I think that we have to recognize that there is not enough done in terms of demonstrating actual practice. When I was the director of the Community Relations Council in Northern Ireland, continually people wanted models. They were afraid of a Pandora box that would be opened if they started to do this. And seeing models that other people were developing was really, really helpful. And I think in that sense, this book is tremendous. All 260 pages of it, I think. It doesn't depend on the relational model. While I am a great fan of people-to-people programs, the challenge I always give is what effect are they having on institutions and structures and power? And I think unless they actually address that fairly early on in their existence, then in fact I think they lose a lot of their capacity, because it becomes, what happens is you have a group of people who think that they're not like everybody else in some ways, but they actually haven't managed to change structures, which is the best way of changing, of course, society. I love the fact that it's an integrated approach. It's one that I think is rarely taken. I know certainly we had to take it when we were in Northern Ireland because we realized, as I say, the people-to-people was not enough. It's very courageous having to ring up government, involved businesses, professional bodies, all of whom are somewhat afraid of this kind of work and afraid that if they take something on, they might not be able to manage it, because we know what happens when different identities come to the fore. Best lessons from contact work research, great. We know that the one-offs don't work. You're not least involved in that. I think its advocacy of single identity work is great. Very often the problem with conflicts are what's happening within groups and not between groups. And if you bring groups together to face each other over the differences, you'll very often have people so afraid within a group that you have a far less open conversation that will happen. Whereas if you have single identity work, and I know from being many times in Israel, you know this too, very often what can happen is that the co-cooperation can be much more difficult to do. I like the idea that you offer facilitation assistance. Again, my experience is that many people, particularly at institutional and governmental level, are afraid of having these kinds of conversations, that they might be seeing themselves as not loyal enough, but also how do they manage the difficult dialogues that are ensured through this kind of work. I love the sequencing. You actually recognize there has to be a sequencing because people get more courage to move, as it were, toward co-partnership. I love the idea that you recognize the importance of evaluation. And reading through the criteria that you gave, it was interesting. It threw me back 20 years ago when I was trying to work out what is the difference between people who are interested in developing partnership work or shared society work and who have at one stage not been, who've been interested much more in the fundamental, narrow, often violent approach to differences. And I thought that the criteria you developed, I had a great deal of problems in developing, so I want to congratulate you particularly on that. And also as somebody who is working in the peace building field and knows now the cries for evaluation, this is invaluable, the work that you've done on this. Further discussion. I think the first thing that came to mind certainly was you're referring to the question of identity and the whole question in Israel about the recent decision to decide that it was a Jewish state, not by many of you, I suspect, but by many others in power. I want to say, I mean, I've looked at this in many different societies, and many of them often feel that to feel confident about their state, they need actually to have it aligned to some sort of identity, and often that's a religious identity. You know, in Ireland, when we got our freedom from the British colonization in 1921, the first thing we did was declared Ireland a Catholic state. And we have been dealing with that for 100 years. I have to tell you, 10 years ago, it was agreed that the state was so varied, we could no longer have it in the constitution, so it was removed. But a really interesting happened only a few weeks ago, and this, as I say, is 100 years later. Almost all schools in Ireland are deemed to be Catholic schools, which means that if people who are secular want to send their children to pretty well any school, they have to some way pretend that they're Catholics. Their children are somehow aligned to an identity. At long last, the church has taken itself in hand and achieved the confidence to say, okay, we're going to separate it. Those who want to be Catholic, we will provide separate programs after school, Saturday, etc. And it's taken that long for them to develop the confidence, or perhaps to realize their hypocrisy that they were placing many people in, and by deciding that all schools had to continue to be Catholic schools. I just want to say it so that you won't give up the discussion. It's not an easy discussion. I must say, when I myself heard that this decision was to deem Israel to be a Jewish state, I kept thinking, but which kind of Jewish? Which kind of Jewish? I know people who are secular from the Hasidic community and right through. And it seems to me that that is a discussion that really has to happen, not least because our societies are developing rapidly. The tension between human rights, I thought, was interesting. One of the problems that happened in Northern Ireland, and if it's of any help, I'd like to tell you about it. Human rights became a weapon that people used. So when we went out to talk to mixed communities about how they'd like to use human rights, they would often use it only for their own people. So it became almost a weapon to deal with against the other. And that happens if you don't do enough relational work. So I think tying the thing in two, we often have had a competitiveness between a human rights approach and a relational approach. The reality is one doesn't work without the other, because if you don't do the relational approach, then people begin to use human rights and the weapons that human rights uses to actually continue to define the conflict. So please keep that up. I love the idea that you focus on single identity. We found that that was a real breakthrough for us in Northern Ireland. And particularly we found the idea of partial facilitators, which meant that we had people from both communities who were very aware of their own identity and their community's identity, but who could model, as it were, a way of dealing with the differences. I'm sure you're probably doing this, but I just thought I would mention it because it was one of the things that was most important for us. I think particularly when I started the Community Relations Council in 1990, we put up on the wall every institution we could think of. These were from political institutions, agricultural institutions, community institutions, educational institutions, because like we reckoned this was an integrated project. It could not succeed because you actually looked at just education, or you looked at just the municipalities, etc. It actually has to be a whole of approach. And I'm aware that that's a tough one. Particularly, I want to say the whole question of power, that the question that was asked of Ran. I've just finished a book on neuroscience and peace building. And one of the things that's come across in the literature is that if you try to deal with tough issues like resources and poverty on the basis of just relations, people inevitably leave it. For instance, when we tried to do it in Northern Ireland, the Protestants who had most power and most resources were pretty well only interested in the relational. The Catholics, on the other hand, who were second-class citizens, were only interested in justice. And actually getting that tension right so that people would continue to engage together was really important. If we hadn't addressed it, I think we would never have got to where we are. In fact, we got to the stage where our logo had equality as the first thing, then coexistence, and then interdependence, which was the interdependence we have on each other. One of the things, and I'm so delighted to hear that you're getting funding, we decided to do the municipal authorities, which, as you can imagine, were sort of, they had fisticuffs literally in many a time when they met together. Such were the tensions. What we did was we set up a fund, and the local councils began to set up a local committee. They had to do it with both businesses and NGOs. And it was that local committee that had to agree to how to spend the money. And I have to tell you, for the first year, nobody spent any money because nobody was willing to cross the line to see what the other would want or need. Within a year, they were beginning to make tentative steps to making shared arrangements. But I think they would not have done that if we actually hadn't got the enticement of funding. And we also found that was true with major institutions, that when we provided the funding for them to do the learning, then in fact that made a big difference. Also, with major institutions, getting examples of how you do it was also critical. I can remember once we got the electricity people on board, then we were able to get all of the other utilities on board as well. I like the idea that you have mentioned it, at least in terms of relations and institutions. The book that I've just finished has really been saying to international relations, very few people change because they change their mind. Most people change because of experiences. And I think we don't take that into enough. People are very willing when they're feeling more safe, they're feeling joyous, they're feeling positive things to change than when they're feeling fear, they're feeling tensions, etc. So the experiential is really important, and you discover that most change happens when the brains are widened, as it were, by that idea. So most people change because of feelings, not knowledge. And the problem is, as academics, we always go to the knowledge rather than concentrating on the feelings. And I'll come to that in a moment when I'm thinking of the last section. Okay, nearly there. This model is the one model I wanted to show you. This is from Reflecting on Peace Practice. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. So it recommends, first of all, there is individual personal change, but that actually has to be tied into socio-political change. It has to be tied with the model being effective with more people. And I think the key one here that perhaps you could look at more, and I know you've looked at it, it's not very easy, is looking at key people. So moving from community to municipal up to the high level politics is something that I think is going to be critical over the next decade or so for people to do this work in Israel. Until we got the actual political parties involved, there was a lot of work we couldn't do. We could do a lot of work to make it easier for them to look at changes, but we really had to get them on board to look at how they would, the models they could use, what could happen within institutions for them to come on board with us. For us, the politicians were almost the last people to come on board, but we could never have signed a peace agreement because they're the ones in the end who do it, and we have to remember that. Thought-provoking, congratulations. I thought the thoughtfulness about this was above ordinary. I just am so delighted to have this as a model. The one question is, I love the fact that it's 260 pages, but I don't think there's going to be too many people who are going to be willing to read that, except perhaps the many academics. I think you may need some sort of a condensed version, particularly with activists, because they're often coming in, they have very little time often to do reading. They need things to help them on sort of a very takeaway basis, and I think work is going to have to go into that. So I think final thing is marketing the book as a useful tool. There will be many different audiences, and I don't know if you've already done it, but you should sit down and think of all the audiences to whom you want to sell or market this book, and then see, do you sell them the whole thing? Do you sell them something that's condensed while referring back to the whole thing for people? We did a lot of work in INCORE with how policymakers change and the sort of way they want to get their information. And mainly they said, we want to get information, first of all, in half a page, then in 2 pages. But they said, we've got to know it's really backed up by research and really backed up by activities and models. I think you've got that second here. I think it's just about thinking how you make it in a condensed version to market to many, many other programs as well. So I want to say many thanks to Ran and to all of Givat Haviva. This was courageous work. This was breaking boundaries. Congratulations to you all, and thank you to Ran for putting it all together. I think the book is
thank you so much, Mary. I'm really sorry, but I happened to mute you in the last couple of sentences. So if you want to say
No
again.
problem. I just was expressing my congratulations. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we hear you now.
I was just expressing my congratulations. This is not just about Israel. It's about so many other countries as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I see some questions already coming up, but we'll do all of the Q&A after all the speakers give their talk. So I'm collecting the questions and we'll get to them later.